This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I tried to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. This week, what is going on with Labour? The results from Hartlepool and the English council elections have had people demanding what the Labour Party is for. If the leader has to go, even can the party survive? I've been talking to veteran Labour MP Jon Cruddas. He's probably spent more time than anyone thinking about and worrying about how Labour can reconnect with what used to be called traditional working class Labour voters. Ed Miliband even asked him to write a review on the problem. He topped the first ballot to be Labour's deputy leader under Gordon Brown, but Jon Cruddas has long sought to influence policy rather than take jobs in the shadow cabinet. If you're looking for analysis that's sympathetic but sharp, urgent but carefully thought through, he's your man. Jon Cruddas, thanks very much for talking to me for this edition of How Did We Get Here? About the Labour Party. Let's start with what's happened over the weekend and the results from Hartlepool and elsewhere. A little bit of time for the dust to settle. Tell me, in your view, how bad were those results?
I think they were pretty bad. I think they were sort of magnified by how we responded to them, actually. So they made to seem even worse than they actually were. But honestly, the Hartlepool election was pretty bad, even though if you sort of take a step back and you look at the votes at the last general election, given the nearly, was it 10,000 that the Brexit Party had at that election, those votes had to go somewhere, and it was always going to be difficult. Given the proximity to Brexit in the recent election, for Labour to win, actually. If you profiled all of those seats with a strong Brexit Party presence at the last election, this would have been one of the most difficult for us if there was any by-election. So that's some bit of context to it. Having said that, we weren't blindsided. This didn't fall out of the sky. It was a very significant defeat. Now you can talk about some of the tactics of having it. Did we have it on the right day? Did we have the right candidate, given that Dr. Williams had been a very senior second referendum advocate and all of that? But that's sort of missing the point, because there's a deeper, longer term significance here in terms of our connection to traditional working class Labour seats, not just in the north and the Midlands, but across the country. So there's that bit. But then on the Saturday, some of the election results weren't that bad, actually.
Do you think, before we get on to the bigger questions, do you think basically the leadership messed it up a bit Friday into Saturday in terms of their response, and it could have been a little bit of a better narrative?
Yeah, I think so. I think they lost control of the narrative, actually. And it sort of span out of control just as all the Sunday journalists were sitting down to, finally press their send copy. Angela Rayner's resignation story sort of detonated politics a bit within the Westminster bubble. And that compounded that sense of loss around Labour and us sort of going on tilt a bit. We sort of lost control of any sort of message disciplining we had there, and we sort of span out of control, even though some of the elections on the Saturday weren't too bad compared to the Hartlepool announcement, which was the first big announcement of that 2-day election. So there was a sense that things got away from us quite badly, and a more colder analysis would say it's a mixed picture. It's not a good picture, but there were some positive signs as well as a lot of big significant defeats there. So it's more of a mixed bag than you'd otherwise think, given the Hartlepool result and the way we responded to it.
Nevertheless, I'm sure you would say there's a problem there. And I can remember you 10 years ago talking about the difficulties of Labour connecting to working class voters, you having to face down people like the BNP in your constituency in terms of a certain appeal that seemed to be working for voters in your constituency. Do you think what you were going through then say, a decade ago, bears any relation and is part of an ongoing issue now in terms of how Labour addresses those sorts of voters?
Very much so. I mean, in one sense, we hit a red wall in Dagenham 10, 12 years ago. You know, we were a sort of outlier to a lot of what's sort of ripped through the political landscape over the last few years, way before Brexit. We had 13 BNP councillors on our council. Nick Griffin stood in the neighbouring seat at the 2010 general election against Margaret Hodge in Barking. They thought they were going to win the seat and take the council on the same day. And that really shook us up. But it was quite a big wake-up call, and we've organised and responded, and in 3 council election series of in a row, we've got 51 out of 51. So we've responded very well, but I wouldn't underestimate the significance of this. And we were arguing at the beginning, watch out here. This is before Labour got thumped in Scotland as well, which was another. Some are arguing that what's happening in the north of England resembles what happened in Scotland. I think our experiences in Barking and Dagenham was more instructive here, because there was always an exceptional political environment in Scotland, given Scottish nationalism. Obviously, we have English nationalism and Brexit, but it's a very different environment. So yes, this stuff has been festering, I would argue, since the midterm of Labour's second term in government, which is 2005, 6, 7. That's when I think we took our eye off the ball of what was happening in working class communities, where wages was flatlining, public services weren't increasing, often populations were growing quite fast, and there was a sense of frustration that Labour wasn't delivering what we wanted. And we were sort of camped out in Middle England, and our priorities were in some of those swing bellwether seats outside of our traditional heartland. So that's where I would pick up the start of this problem which presented itself in Brexit, presented itself with some of the battles in the BNP, and is now presenting itself with some of the red wall problems, not just in the north and the Midlands, but across the landscape. So it is a big issue for us.
So what was the appeal that others have been able to tap into to take those voters that people would say traditionally, hang on, they should be Labour voters?
The most potent message that I heard coming out of Hartlepool, which you couldn't really miss in all the vox pops, were the sense of people saying Labour's taken us for granted. You hear that time and time again as a sort of drumbeat on that election, was that nothing's changed. Labour's taken us for granted. We got this mayor now who's getting in the free port, who's getting investment in and jobs across the Tees Valley. And in one sense, the Hartlepool candidate slipstreamed behind both the personality of Boris Johnson, saying he got Brexit done, but also this very impressive mayor of Teesside in terms of what he's doing with the airport, the free port, and that sense of a place that has been taken for granted is being reprioritised politically. Whatever the political persuasion, it has a new focus on it. And the amount of people who told us many years ago when the BNP were rampaging, well, people are listening to us now. People are taking us seriously, and there's that sense of protest and anger to sort of to challenge traditional incumbency in a time when everyone's reacting against the political classes anyway. So there's a sort of a dangerous combination of factors in there. Our own history and what we've done, our own history in government that still resonates in terms of what we did and didn't do. The character of Johnson himself, which I see this very much as almost very similar to 1979, where there's a major class realignment occurring on the right of politics, which kept the Conservative Party in power for 18 years in effect. And it seems to me there's an equivalent thing occurring now on the right of politics in terms of changing the class composition. And we have to watch out, because it took us a generation to come back last time. And we're already 11 years into this Conservative government.
When you hear people talk about things like values and the realignment is no longer about class politics, where you could have said, right, the English working class vote, that should be a Labour vote. But now people say people don't vote in those sorts of economic terms in the same way. It's more about values and who they think they are. Does that ring true to you? What do you think?
Well, I think it's always been complicated. I mean, I think residualising class to ones of economic material issues has always been too restricted. There's always been cultural, or I think what we have lost is a cultural or an emotional connection with many working class communities, and that lies beneath what's happening to us now. We seem remote, technocratic still. We seem very urban in our character, very preoccupied with younger urban and university communities, and when you mix that alongside this sense of having taken for granted traditional communities, that's quite a toxic mix for us, which we have to dispel. And the other side of it is, to be perfectly honest, we were seen to not really stand for much in terms of this election, in terms of going in with an agenda. We weren't really planting a flag around a series of policies and ideas. Now, I understand that because Keir Starmer's been the leader for a year in a lockdown when he hasn't even been able to meet his shadow cabinet. So it has been an extraordinary, unique period from which to start your period as Labour leader. But undoubtedly there was that. What I found quite worrying, Andy, was not the rejection and the anger against Labour. It was the sort of indifference to it. You know, it was that sort of sense of, well, you're not really on the park, you know? So compared to the Corbyn years, people didn't appear to be throwing us out of their porches or, you know, not allowing us to cross open their gate. But in its place was a sort of agnostic, sort of not that interested, that indifference, which is rather dangerous as a political sort of currency, you know.
I just want to go back to what you said about losing that emotional connection between Labour and the sort of traditional working class. I mean, again, there's lots of chat that the people who are running the Labour Party, the people who are MPs, are more interested in talking about, okay, let me use the phrase, the kind of woke agenda that will appeal to university graduates and young people. Do you think that's a problem, that just does not connect with the people who should be voting Labour?
I think there's an even bigger problem, if I can put it this way. I think there are many in Labour now who are debating whether we should go all in now and say, look, the Conservatives have got a 25 point lead amongst working class voters. Labour's membership is 75% from social classes A, B, C. It's increasingly attracting its voters from social classes A, B, C, 1. So the classes are realigning. We get more and more of our voters from the Remain base, whereas the Conservatives are getting them from the Leave. Maybe the landscape's changing and we should double down on this new base for progressive politics, which is in university towns, which is in our urban environments, which is amongst younger, from the black ethnic minority, BME communities, as well as younger people, those with degrees. And that is the future. Now, to me, that's got tripwires around that whole thing. Firstly, I'm not sure there's ever a coalition there for Labour able to get back in power again, because we will stack up big majorities in urban seats and university towns, and we'll probably win a few more, but we'll lose a lot more of these traditional red wall seats. And the second point is not just about electoral arithmetic, is whether that's the right thing to do. I mean, the Labour Party, the political parties don't just fall out of the sky. They're built out of histories and traditions and approaches to questions of justice. And ours was always, as I understood it, the party who was seeking to advance economically, materially, the interests of the working class of the country. And you can't just, pick that up and let it go again. You can't just dispose of these traditions easily, because there's a danger if you compound that sense of people thinking you're indifferent to your own history and to people who've traditionally supported you. So it's not just a question of electoral arithmetic, it's also a question of values and history as well.
So how does Labour as a party renew its connection with those voters who you're clearly not prepared to write off and say we're going to go looking elsewhere and going to go hunting for votes elsewhere? How do you renew that appeal then?
Well, it's not easy, but just as we're talking, in North America, there appears to be a person who's nearly 80 years old who's managing with quite an agile way to bridge these traditional constituencies for progressive politics and the new constituencies. I'm talking about Joe Biden, who in his first 100 days has come up with a massive economic stimulus. He's talking about building 18 million jobs, quote, that you can raise your family on, decent jobs. He's recommitting around the trade unions. He's uniting the traditional working class base of America in that sort of in the traditional Rust Belts, with its more progressive, younger constituencies across its east and west coast. And there is a ready-made example being played out in real time, not too far away, that we might want to learn from. Because the point I make is it should not be beyond our collective wit to do so if someone like Joe Biden is managing with such agility to pull together a coalition of the old and the new. That's what we have to do. It's not a question of picking sides or only playing on one side of the pitch here. Someone like Andy Burnham, I was listening to his language when he accepted in his victory speech at the weekend. He was talking about the dignity of Labour. He was talking about transport. He was talking about a policy agenda that could unite and weave together these new and old constituencies around Labour and rebuild a coalition across the so-called Red Wall and these new heartlands in the cities and the university towns.
Dignity of Labour, title of a book you've recently written. But isn't there also a problem that Boris Johnson is spending big? I mean, it's not a question. Maybe that would have been a little bit easier, the sort of outline you've put together there back in the 80s, when there was clearly an economic philosophy in Thatcherism and the Conservative Party at that time, which is a world away from what's going on at the moment.
And I do not underestimate the significance of what's going on in the Conservative Party. The danger is, and you could hear that in some of our messaging around the sort of sleaze debates. It's just same old Tories, same old sleaze, and there's this thing that they've always been like this. This is the party of Margaret Thatcher. Well, this is not the party of Margaret Thatcher at all. In fact, the way that there's almost a shameless shape-shifting across the Conservative. I would say, I don't think you would agree with that, but they are changing the character of the Conservative Party dramatically, almost overnight, in ways that we should be very wary of what's happening, because I do see it as an equivalent to 1979, what's happening here. And we weren't quick enough, and we weren't responsive and agile enough to see what was happening in real time around us. And we've paid a very heavy price for being out of power for 18 years. And I think we could be out of power for longer than that if we are not keep our eye on what's happening all around us. And that's why I don't think it would be a disaster for us to say, well, Boris Johnson's doubling down on these red wall seats. We'll just double down on this new part of the electoral landscape in the south. Look where we're doing in London. Look what we've done in Bristol and the west. That's our new heartlands. We'll just refocus our attention there. I think that will gift elections to the Conservatives if we withdraw from some of these battlegrounds.
But practically, come back to this idea that it would be, it's very difficult to see what Keir Starmer could promise now in terms of spending and development that could outdo an incumbent Conservative government, and or is there a way of doing it better, or framing the debate slightly differently about how you invest and how you spend? What could the Labour leadership currently do, looking at the landscape that it faces today?
Well, let me give you an example where I don't think they will do what they need to do to consolidate this new strategy within the Conservative Party. I don't think, which I go through in my book, the Conservative Party built their whole Thatcherite agenda around deregulating the labour market, undermining rights for people at work, attacking the unions, removing some of the skills machinery and all sorts. I don't think the Conservative Party can go back and try and rebuild the dignity of work, right? So, for example, they know they should do, but they won't be able to do it because of the hangover of Margaret Thatcher. Theresa May set up an analysis of modern employment conditions under Matthew Taylor of the RSA called the Taylor Report. Had loads of ideas about how you could deal with the gig economy, for example, but they couldn't go there. So nothing has come out of it. Theresa May played around with putting workers on boards to try and, change some of the stakeholding in industry, but the party wouldn't let her. Boris, we've got the Queen's speech coming out. There won't be an employment bill in this Queen's speech because the Conservatives won't allow their leader to go back and rebuild the dignity of work. Meanwhile, you have 500 British gas workers sacked because they wouldn't accept a new contract. Or you've got Deliveroo drivers on £2 an hour on their shifts whilst their chief executive gets 500 million in share options. The Supreme Court comes out and says for Uber drivers, their employment should be regulated more. There is a gap there on the quality of jobs in the economy. If you look at think tanks, independent think tanks like the RSA, they're saying job quality, given our profound productivity problems in the economy, could be the big agenda for the future. I don't think the Conservative Party will be able to do what's necessary to confront some of these enduring productivity problems and work quality in our economy and living standards issues because of that, and that creates an opportunity for Labour. So when Andy Burnham's talking about the dignity of Labour, when Angela Rayner has now got a new job title around the future of work, I think there are signs there that Labour is beginning to recognise that is a big central battle over the next years around quality issues around future employment. As we come out of pandemic and the furlough programme ends and unemployment is again centre stage.
You've mentioned Andy Burnham, you've mentioned Angela Rayner. What about Keir Starmer? Is he the leader right now that the party needs?
I look at it slightly differently to a lot of the commentary about Keir Starmer. I look at it and I think he's the son of a toolmaker and a nurse. Right, he was the first in his family generationally to go to university. He's the same age as me. We were there's a generational thing of very high social mobility and aspiration out of those working class families. He became incredibly successful internationally. He gained a reputation before he was an MP in defending questions of human dignity against, in this instance, the death penalty worldwide. He's palpably not in it for the money. He's a good guy. I think everyone accepts essential decency of the man. I think he has that backstory and a proven track record before he entered Parliament around some issues that should be centre stage around human dignity, economic and social rights. If he could just speak to that agenda that obviously inspired him before he became an MP, that could inspire us and it could inspire the country in the years ahead. Now, I know that's not the usual analysis you get around Westminster to say, well, he's a North London lawyer. I look a bit beyond that, and he's a North London lawyer. But before that, his whole backstory is a story of quite dramatic social mobility and aspiration on behalf of working people, which is the story we need to tell for the country.
And do you think he can lead the party to victory at the next election?
Well, look, we've lost 4 in 11. I mean, any cursory look at these election results over the last couple of days tell us it's going to be tough. Having said that, I look around and I see sort of there are depths to him that I don't think people have seen yet. I'm an old Labour guy. I back the leader, whoever it is. I respect the office of the leader of the party. That's what we all should do, who hold a Labour ticket. We shouldn't be sniping around. There's too much of this bad-mouthing and briefing. After the elections, we should support the leader. And I actually think, and I don't know Keir Starmer, really. I didn't vote for him. I voted for Lisa Nandy. But I actually think he has a combination of personal characteristics and skills that, if he can speak to that agenda, could really pack a punch as we come out of lockdown. Look, the other side of this, which we haven't talked about in this recent election, is this was unique because people had feared death. They've been staring death in the face, actually, and there is this palpable relief about getting the vaccine and acknowledging the role of their governments, whether it's in Wales or England, of delivering vaccination. So there's a uniqueness to this. And as we emerge out of lockdown, hopefully we get to head for dry land. Gradually, the terms of political debate will change. People will be demanding more than the immediate antidote to the pandemic. And I'm optimistic that if he can speak to that gender that I think he has spoken to before he was an MP, it could connect with people and also could speak to people's hopes and aspirations for their families across the whole country, in towns and regions across the UK.
I mean, just a quick thought. yeah, obviously after these results, some in the Labour Party have been saying we needed to go back to a more Corbynite agenda, a more Corbynite sense of the party. Do you think that sort of leadership would have done any better?
No, I don't. I think in this elections there is still a rollout from Brexit. You can detect that in terms of we performed least well in high Brexit supporting areas. There was also the uniqueness of the vaccination programme and acknowledging and rewarding governance in whatever country or area that had oversight to that. So I don't think a Blair agenda or a Corbyn agenda would have done any better. I think we would have got both barrels, whatever, actually. And there's a danger of, as someone once said, overcorrecting immediately after elections. I think we should hold our heads a bit and keep our eye on the bigger picture, because this was a unique set of elections. They were mixed and messy. There were some very bad results, which have been festering for 20 years. They didn't fall out of the sky. And I think Keir Starmer has some sort of skill set and personal backstory that could rise to the occasion as we bend out of the vaccination period into the cold light of day after the furlough programme's finished. So there are grounds for optimism, that's what I'm saying.
Grounds for optimism, right. Well, I'm going to give you one final thought, though, which is political parties are born, they also die. I mean, and there are people who are saying the Labour Party has got to get out of the way. It's kind of sitting in this sort of centre-left position and preventing other things coming along. Do you worry ever that, you know what, the Labour Party could just wither away, and that's the process that we're seeing? Yeah,
I do, actually. If I'm honest, I wonder about it. Some very good friends of mine, and it goes back to some of our earlier part of our conversation, who say, look, the Labour Party's gone, the page has turned, we're on the wrong side of history given what we stood for and our origins. We should now literally become the Progressive Party or the Radical Liberal Party, and we should double down into the universities and, try and take on board some of the rise in the green agenda, which we should anyway, but we should be quite consciously change the name and become something very different. And that's some variation of a radical liberal or progressive party, because that train's left the station in terms of what Labour was, and that's not coming back. I dispute that. That's the reason I wrote this book, is because I fear that decision is not even being debated, but at some stage we might wake up without even having had that debate and discover that we have become a different party by stealth almost. And I want us to have that debate before it's too late.
But you think the Labour Party can and must survive?
Yes, I do. I think, and that's why I'm the Biden experience, I think, gives me much greater optimism than I had when Trump was in, when there was this rise of authoritarian populism across the planet, where Brexit was rolling through. I think you can, it looks to me like it's possible to rebuild a coalition across our old and new constituencies, to get out of these binaries that are killing the left between young and old, those with a degree, those without, leave, remain, urban, suburban or rural or towns. There is one big example out there that shows this is possible, and we shouldn't just choose sides, because that is, to me, political death of Labour.
You mean the Joe Biden example?
Yeah, exactly. The Joe Biden example. A 78-year-old from West Mayo in west of Ireland is the solution to this dilemma.
Well, a few generations back, maybe.
A few generations back, but there is there's power in those lands. There is an example, and the interesting thing to me is the dexterity that he shows, and no one ever saw that. But it demonstrates where there's the political will to transcend these binaries and not get trapped by them, then there is a future for the left and Labour.
Jon Cruddas, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here, and a debate that is going to go on and is going to be of crucial importance to us all in this country. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Jon Cruddas MP, still faithful to the Labour Party but anxious and clear-eyed in what he thinks needs to happen now. If you have comments on this or ideas for other podcasts, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.